Microplastics, it's becoming a major buzzword when it comes to global sustainability. These tiny bits of plastic have been found everywhere, from the bottom of the ocean to inside our own human blood. I speak to professor and researcher Jesse Meiller to learn more about the sources of this pollution and its effects on the environment and our bodies.
Meiller is a marine ecologist and environmental toxicologist. She's a professor at Georgetown University's Earth Commons Institute.
Maybe we'll start with the very basics. What are microplastics?
So microplastics are any plastic that is smaller than 5 millimeters in size. They're essentially tiny little pieces of plastic. That's anything that's smaller than a pencil eraser. Most of them come from larger plastics that enter the environment, and they break up into smaller and smaller pieces. And the reason for that is because they get exposed to sunlight or to chemicals, or they're moving around against rocks or other things in the environment. But they're not degrading, they're not breaking up chemically. They're just breaking up into smaller and smaller pieces of plastic. Even though microplastics are so small in size, they've been shown to be one of the major components of plastic pollution in the environment.
Plastics can take anywhere from 20 to 500 years to decompose. According to the United Nations, only about 9% of plastic in the world is recycled. That means much of it ends up in bodies of water. Every year, tens of millions of tons of plastic enter the world's oceans.
One of the things that's really jarring is they're everywhere. I mean, from the bottom of the sea to they're just everywhere. Can you explain why?
Well, microplastics are made from almost everything that we use every day that is plastic. So that includes things like, when we're drinking out of a water bottle or out of a coffee cup, unfortunately baby bottles as well, those kinds of things. But then also from the clothes that we wear, and if they're synthetic fibers, and then also when we're driving on the roads, our car tires are shedding microplastics. So they are everywhere. They're ubiquitous because they're being shed from so many different types of plastic. And we found that most of the microplastics that are in the environment, even though they end up in the oceans, they start out on land. They come from us, from the things that we're using, the plastic objects and items that we're using every day. There's been a lot of work on microplastics in the oceans. And that's because everything that starts out on land eventually ends up in the oceans because of, when it rains and it carries it off of the land, it runs off of the land into the waterways. And then eventually they make their way, rivers end up feeding the oceans. And so makes its way to the oceans. But, we also know that microplastics can become airborne, and they can travel long distances in the air by the wind and be redeposited back to the Earth's surface, whether that's in our waterways where we get our drinking water, or it's on farmland where we're growing our crops, or, around our homes and places of work. Microplastics can be anywhere.
I remember back, I think it would have been the 80s, there was the no nukes movement, that like nuclear waste is going to be here forever and stuff. But it seems like microplastics are going to be here forever. It seems, why is it that they take so long to be in they don't even break down, do they? Can you talk about that?
We've only had plastics around for over 100 years, but we started to see a pretty big deposition of plastics around 1945 when there was a big population boom, and we started to see more plastics. And today we end up with somewhere like quadruple the amount of plastics just in the last 30 years for plastic consumption. It just keeps going up, and we're producing more and more plastic.
What got you interested in this?
That's a good question. So I've always been, interested in environmental pollution. I've studied all different kinds of pollution in the environment, but I ended up focusing on microplastics because it is something that is so, it's an emerging contaminant, something that people are starting to learn more about, but because it doesn't go away and because it has so many different aspects of potential toxicity, that's why I became interested in it and feel the need to talk about it. That's why I'm here today, to raise awareness about it and work with my students and with outreach groups and community groups and try to share what I know about it, because it is a really pressing issue.
Let me ask you about breaking through the clutter, because, when you talk about climate change, it's like every night when I'm anchoring the news, we're talking about drought or fire or hurricanes or cyclones. We're not really talking about microplastics. It's kind of like a niche story within a larger story. How do you break through the clutter?
Well, we could make the connection to climate. That would be a big one. I mean, there's a really close connection between climate and plastics. 98% of all plastics actually being derived from fossil fuels, and most of it has come from petroleum. But more recently, plastic industries have started to switch to using natural gas liquids as a source of plastic production. The plastic production process is extremely energy intensive, from the extraction of the fossil fuels to the production of the plastic to the use of the plastic, and then all the way through disposal, plastic waste disposal. And so, noting that plastics actually are contributing to greenhouse gas emissions and therefore the climate crisis, that's a place that we can actually focus. It's actually there was a study that was done that actually showed that if the global plastic life cycle was a country, it would be the 5th largest greenhouse gas emitter in the world. Yeah. So, I mean, those are the sorts of things that it's on us to make those connections and connect it to what people are talking about, like climate change.
Meiller takes her students into the field to understand how microplastics are affecting waterways in the Washington, D.C. region, especially in the Potomac and Anacostia Rivers.
In your TED Talk, you talked about going out with your students and kind of the jarring results that you came up with. Can you talk about that and what did it teach you about what we have as a potential ticking time bomb out there?
Microplastics have been, are almost ubiquitous in the environment. They are everywhere that people have looked for them so far. The tops of the tallest mountains like Mount Everest, in the Alps and in the Pyrenees, and then all the way down to the deepest depths of the ocean in the Mariana Trench, in the Western Pacific Ocean. And so it's not surprising that my students and I ended up finding microplastics in DC waterways, and why I've continued to work with them around DC, because they really are pretty common today. Even in other places like in ice cores and in Arctic snow and stuff like that. It's just that we're seeing them in so many different places. So DC waterways are not, I guess, unique in that aspect. Urban centers, though, it's really interesting thinking about urban areas compared to more remote areas. And recently, a number of different studies have been looking at microplastic levels in urban areas. There was a study that was done in London, another one in Paris, and another one in Nanjing. And one of those studies actually found that microplastics in urban areas can be 20 times higher than in remote locations.
What about plastic and microplastics and how they impact urban rivers in general?
So there was an estimate recently that 30 million tons of plastic waste are currently in our oceans. And in rivers, they found that it was about 109 million tons, which is significantly more. So what that means is even if we're able to, or when we're able to tackle and really manage our plastic waste problem and stop the flow of plastic into the environment, that the rivers, the load of plastic waste in the rivers is still going to be contributing to plastic in the oceans. Much of that plastic is coming from urban areas. So a lot of the urban rivers tend to be the heavier load of the plastics that are eventually going to enter the oceans.
Let me ask about marine ecosystems and microplastics contaminating the food chain from zooplankton to fish to mammals. Can you kind of walk us through that?
Sure, yeah. So, I mean, fish are certainly, what we always think of when we think of microplastics being in something that we want to be aware of. But the reality is that while there was one study actually that found 85% of fish that were tested actually had microplastics in them. But it's not just fish, because there's over 200 different species that have been shown to ingest microplastics. Everything from protists to cnidarians to amphipods and decapods, echinoderms and mollusks. We often think of, shellfish like oysters and mussels and clams, like those types of mollusks, but also turtles and mammals and birds, as well as fish. So the reason I list all of those out is because microplastics are entering the food web at every level, all the way up. So the fish that are, that are still ingesting microplastics, they're also eating other organisms that have also ingested microplastics. And they are being eaten by organisms that have ingested microplastics. So at every point along the way, there has been, the introduction of microplastics into the food chain. And a number of these types of plastics have been shown to cause liver damage in fish, and oysters that were exposed to polystyrene, which is styrofoam, ended up with decreased egg and sperm production, which affected their reproduction. So there are a number of different examples of where fish, but also other organisms can be affected as well. So, just focusing on fish is one thing because we, as a species, eat a lot of fish, but there are other organisms that are also playing a role in the exposure of fish to microplastics.
From the food we eat to the air we breathe, humans are exposed to microplastics daily. Microplastics can be absorbed by the gut, and they've been found in the lungs and human blood. Surgeries can also lead to microplastics in the body. A study by the American Chemical Society even found microplastics in heart tissue of cardiac surgery patients.
So you go out just about anywhere and you can find them, which means at some point they're inside us, right?
Yeah. In 2019, so about 4 years ago, the World Health Organization reported that microplastics were ubiquitous and that there was enough evidence that the effects of nano and microplastics could potentially cause harm. So this raised a lot of awareness. People started talking about microplastics more often. But, the harm that can come from plastics can come from lots of different components of the plastics, including some of the additives that are used in the plastics. This bisphenol A or BPA, which is one of the additives that has been commonly used, that is it's used to make plastics harder and stronger and more resistant to high heat. Another one is called phthalates, which is it's an additive that's used to make other types of plastics more pliable and flexible. And these are just two examples of different kinds of additives that can be used in the plastic manufacturing process. But a number of them, including BPA and phthalates, have been shown to have endocrine disrupting effects, which means that they can mess up hormone systems in organisms, including humans. A number of years ago, we were started to hear that plastics were able to do things like to cross the human intestinal barrier, to be present in human placentas. Just this year, there were 2 studies that found that plastics were in human testes and semen, and another one in human breast milk, and those were both just this year. But we also know that microplastics can be present in human blood. There was a study that was looking at blood samples that were collected from the general population, and they found microplastics there. And then more recently, there was another study that found microplastics in human vein tissues, which is interesting because it demonstrates that microplastics can be transported within human blood vessels. So it's just, there's a lot of different modes of delivery from the things that we're consuming, but then also potentially through inhalation, because we know that microplastics and microfibers can become airborne relatively easily, and we can inhale them. They can come into our lungs. There's a study that showed just a couple years ago about the presence of microplastics in human lungs, and also that they might cause lung lesions. And these lesions are more, they're tied to individual susceptibility of the people that are exposed to them, and then also potentially the plastic properties themselves. So while we know that there are a lot of different kinds of exposure for humans, there's still a number of studies that are ongoing investigating, especially the long-term health effects of exposure to microplastics. But what we do know is that plastic can be toxic to laboratory animals, to marine species, and to human cell lines.
So there was a point in your response there, I'm being somewhat facetious, where I thought, if she keeps going, I'm going to jump out the window. I mean, it's scary stuff. This is like a Stephen King novel. Are there nights where this just keeps you up at night?
No, I really do. That's why I'm sitting here talking to you today. This is why I work with students and why I do outreach programs. I think that we each have an individual responsibility to not only change what we're doing in our daily lives and to move away from things like single-use plastics, but to also raise awareness and to share what we know with other people, whether that's in our homes and in our communities, in our workplaces, and then at the policy level to try to really push for policies that are going to make a difference and stop the flow of plastic that is causing these problems and creating more microplastic.
As the United Nations works towards a landmark international plastics treaty, major chemical and plastics manufacturers have pushed to weaken the proposal. Environmental groups warn the UN talks need to focus not only on issues like recycling and ocean waste, but also on an overall reduction of plastics production in the first place.
There's an industry involved in this that must have a lot of lobbying dollars, because I don't see, I mean, people are talking about this issue, but I still go to the grocery store, there are plastic bags everywhere, plastic stuff. I mean, as I was explaining to you when I was a young kid, everywhere you went, it was bottles, you know, like glass bottles and aluminum. Now it's plastic, plastic, plastic. How do you take on a mammoth industry like that?
Well, I mean, it starts with looking at where the biggest issues are. And for what we're seeing in the environment, we know that single-use plastics are a big component of plastic waste and plastic pollution. So our reliance on single-use plastics has really took off during the plastic production increase that we were seeing, the rise in plastic production. And so there have been a couple studies a few years ago, one from National Academy of Sciences and the other one from researchers at Pew Charitable Trust, that, you know, we're focusing more on how we're going to tackle the plastic pollution problem. And what they found was that the largest and perhaps easiest solution was to stop using plastic in things that were intended for single-use purposes. It doesn't make sense to be using plastic in something that we use once, because it sticks around for so long in the environment. It breaks up into microplastics, and it potentially causes so much harm that it doesn't make sense to be using something like that. So, you know, we haven't really had single-use plastics in our lives as far as human history goes for that long, right? I mean, it's a relatively recent phenomenon, but you know, today, half of all plastic that's produced is intended for single-use plastics. So we need to really stop using plastic for single-use purposes to move away from that. That will certainly help with the demand for plastic. And that's something that we can all do, is to eliminate single-use plastics from our lives.
It just seems like there's so many aspects of our lives that are kind of fueling this. When we get up in the morning, what should we be thinking about? In terms of even putting on our clothes in the morning, I mean, how we dress, everything.
Sure. Yeah. A couple of things. One, you know, if it's possible to make a difference in your life, I would say, as far as plastic goes, the biggest thing is to work towards eliminating single-use plastics from your lives. Identify the different points in that you're using them, right? And to find examples of, or find alternatives that you can use instead that are reusable, not wasteful. So that's a big one. And then I would say also, as far as you mentioned, clothes and textiles, and there are a number of different textiles that are that we use, that we wear in our clothes, that we don't even really recognize as being synthetic in nature, that are contributing to microfibers and microplastics in the environment. These include, you know, fabrics and textiles, including like polyester and rayon, acrylic and nylon. And when we wear these clothes, they shed the microfibers into the air, into the environment. And then when we wash those clothes in our laundry, they end up in the water. The water then goes to wastewater treatment plants. It gets filtered, and then it ends up out in the local waterways. Usually it still contains microplastics and microfibers because they're so small, it's very difficult to remove them. So choosing our clothing to be natural fibers as much as possible is a step that we can also take. You mentioned food also, and thinking about the food that we're choosing and trying to move away from packaging. I mean, a third of all of the plastic that is produced goes to packaging. So that's an area that we really can improve upon. And so when we're purchasing, the foods in the grocery store, trying to be intentional and thoughtful about what we're purchasing and how it's packaged, trying to choose things that actually have little to no packaging, and trying to choose things that are not covered in plastic.
I want to close with you kind of a little bit of hope. Buck us up.
Sure.
Send us out on our way to kind of tackle this problem, because we can overcome this.
We can, and we need to. I mean, this is an issue that we have all contributed to, right? We're all playing a role in the amount of microplastics in the environment, and the choices that we make, the items that we buy and use every day. They're contributing to the problem, and we can then contribute to the solution and strategies that will help to alleviate the problem that's already there. So really moving in that direction is the way that I try to talk to people about. I work with community groups and do outreach and to raise awareness. But the more that we can do as individuals and the choices that we make, they do make a difference. Our individual choices make a difference. We need to carry that forward, though, and affect change at higher levels as well in order to have systemic change. And those changes come from actually moving away from things, trying to purchase things intentionally without the single-use plastics being a part of it, working with your local communities and your local governments to try to implement policies that are going to be effective at stopping the flow of plastic, specifically targeting single-use plastics.
Well, thank you for leaving us with some hope. Get us all inspired. Go out there and achieve something. Appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Mike. It was great to be here.